A&E, this is Biography. For December 19th, 2001, Biography with Harry Smith.
Tony Blair. His meteoric rise to Prime Minister revived the British Labour Party and the spirits of his countrymen. Tony Blair was recently quoted as saying that he wants to eradicate terrorism totally. Anyone who doubts his seriousness should look at the schedule he's kept since the September 11th attacks on America. In that time, Blair has worked tirelessly to shore up support for the war against terrorism and present the case against Al-Qaeda to the world.
Never forget how we felt watching the planes fly into those twin towers. September the 11th is no less appalling today than it was on that day. We have a job to do, it is being done, and we will see it through to the end.
Within days of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, British Prime Minister Tony Blair raced across the Atlantic to stand with America in its time of agony.
So honored the British Prime Minister has crossed an ocean to show his unity with America. Thank you for coming, friend.
In the days ahead, Tony Blair would become the world's most important advocate in the war against terror.
Our objective will be to bring to account those who have organized, aided, abetted and incited this act of infamy.
The whole world has seen him in a somewhat different light and have really elevated him to the global stage where he belongs.
But for those who knew him at home in Great Britain, Tony Blair would remain an enigma.
There's a question which very few thinking people in Britain have yet quite resolved, and that is this guy sincere, or is he just acting?
Like the man he was most often compared to, Bill Clinton, Blair was a child of the baby boom generation, a rock and roll prime minister, the youngest in almost 200 years.
Just take one, just squeeze it.
Well, there you are. This is my wife instead.
Handsome and charismatic. Brilliant. Tony Blair brought a new vitality to the traditionally stodgy 10 Downing Street.
I think he's made Britain seem more approachable. He's a younger, new mould of politician. He's definitely a 21st century politician.
In the early 1920s, Glasgow, Scotland was a thriving shipbuilding port, birthplace of great ocean liners like the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary. Leo Blair, an abandoned child of professional music hall entertainers, grew up on Glasgow's mean streets, but he was determined to succeed, a self-made man who tried various jobs before choosing to study law.
He was brought up in the slums of Glasgow, a very poor area, saturated with working class traditions and a communist tradition. But then he pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. He got himself a job as a lecturer in law, started to earn some money.
Right after World War II, Leo met a young Irish woman named Hazel Corskadon. They hit it right off, and before long were married in 1948. They raised a family in the Scottish capital of Edinburgh. Leo and Hazel had 3 children, William, Sarah, and Tony. Anthony Charles Linton Blair was born May 6, 1953. When Tony was 5, the family moved to Durham, an industrial city in the north of England where his father taught law at the university. Leo, remembering his own painful childhood, wanted only the best for his sons. He sent both boys to the top private school in the area, Choristers. The 14th century cathedral school was a friendly community of choir boys and day students like Tony. Among Tony's several talents was a gift for charming misbehavior.
He had that smile in those days, and some of the things he said and got away with might be considered a little outrageous. I taught him maths. I was marking a test and suddenly came across the word rhinoceros, which I don't normally associate with mathematics. So when I gave the test back, I called to him, "What on earth is this?" And he came out and said, "Well, sir, I knew that the answer to the question, which is the longest side of a right-angled triangle, was something like hippopotamus, but I knew if you said that, you would explode, and rhinoceros was then the first idea that came into my head."
He may have been a smart aleck, but he was just plain smart as well, earning above-average grades, and he was an excellent athlete.
He was good at cricket as a bowler. He was good at rugby, and one year was voted within the school the best rugby player of the year. And interestingly, with hindsight, he turned out to be good at the hurdles, a very useful attribute, I think, for a politician.
Tony had a flair for the dramatic. At choristers, he acted in several productions and once played a Conservative Party candidate in a mock election. Tony was as happy at school as he was at home with his close-knit family.
I had a delightful childhood. My parents were wonderful to me. I had a very happy upbringing.
But things suddenly took a turn for the worst. When Tony was 10, Leo Blayer suffered a serious stroke.
It changed our whole circumstances because we were very much a family on the out. Dad was a very successful barrister, and suddenly it all ended. He had to learn to speak again. He was never able to take up an active part in public life, though he recovered sufficiently to be a part-time judge, and our whole lifestyle changed, obviously.
Despite the family's misfortune, Tony's good grades allowed him to continue in top private schools. At 13, Tony won a scholarship to Fettes, one of the best prep schools in Edinburgh, with a tradition and history as forbidding as its look.
It's a big sort of Gothic. It looks like you know those fairy tale castles in Disney. It looks like one of those sort of big turrets and sort of pointed towers.
It's described or thought of as most people as the Scottish version of Eton, which is where Prince William went. So it's not exactly common at all.
The curriculum at Fettes was rigorous, but Tony did well, and he continued to pursue sports and theatre. His unhappiness there was no act. Blayer rebelled against the school's tradition of fagging.
That's where you're supposed to look after older boys, and it's a very sort of feudal system, and I didn't much like that.
The boys have to do chores for the older boys, for the prefects, that they have to be very polite, they have to dress strictly in their uniforms, there are bedtimes, there are strong rules.
There was caning. Discipline was very strict when he was starting, certainly, and he hated it, absolutely hated it.
Blayer never fully adjusted to the stiff traditions of British prep school life. He flouted hair and wardrobe rules and challenged the way things were done.
I was always rebelling against rules and discipline. I was certainly a rebel at school, yeah, very much so. I was always, in trouble one sort or another, but I mean, let me not exaggerate, I didn't get chucked out of the school.
There were a number of occasions when the school authorities tried to discipline him or tried to throw him out, and yet he managed to charm his way out of trouble generally.
In 1972, Tony's natural rebellious nature was further fueled by the events of the day. Tony left the stodgy north of England and moved 2 hours outside of London to study at Oxford. London was still swinging in those days, as it had been since the 60s.
At the end of the 60s, early 70s, when we were coming of age, London was obviously an extremely exciting place to be. Most of the music that was dominating the world came out of London. There was great clubs, there was Carnaby Street, everybody had long hair and smoking dope and buying bootleg records and having lots of relationships and generally having a good time.
At At Oxford, Blair became part of the times. He grew his hair even longer and joined a mediocre band called Ugly Rumors, for which he sang lead, imitating Mick Jagger.
The great thing about people who lived in the 60s and early 70s, or were teenagers at that time, it gave people a tolerance. And I think one of the great things that Tony Blair has is tolerance.
When Tony Blair left Oxford in 1975, he was 22 and had a growing desire to make a difference in the world. The only question was, how? In 1975, 2 weeks after graduating from Oxford, Tony Blair suffered a major blow. His beloved mother, Hazel, died of cancer at the age of 52. Tony was devastated. Unsure of where he was going, the 22-year-old left the spires of Oxford for the bright lights of Paris. In the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, he spent several months bartending, among other things, on the left bank. But the ambitions he had inherited from his father surfaced. He returned to London to begin preparing for a future in law and politics. He decided to join Britain's Labour Party.
But the reason why I suppose I became so passionately committed to the Labour Party, didn't choose the Tory Party, is that I think there are only two political philosophies. One is that says, look, the individual's there, you're on your own, you make what you can, and it's up to you. And the other says, look, you actually live in a community, in a society of other people, and you in part depend upon those other people to succeed. And I was drawn, as a matter of belief, to that political philosophy.
But at that point in Blair's life, politics took a back seat to his law career. In England, law school graduates are required to spend time working in an established firm. Blair tried for a spot with one of the country's top lawyers, noted attorney Alexander Derry Irvine. But there was one problem. Irvine already had a student.
Cherie Booth had been signed up to become my pupil in that year, and she was a very bright young girl. She'd come from Liverpool, she went to the London School of Economics, she got a very, very good degree. She'd come out top in her bar finals.
Though the beautiful and brilliant Cherie Booth had better academic credentials than Tony Blair, he was persuasive and charming.
He made an immediate impression on me because he was very personable. I reckoned that he was very, very determined, and his powers of persuasion were sufficient to persuade me to do what I didn't really want to do, which is take two rather than one.
So Irvine made room for Blair on his staff. It was a golden opportunity.
Derry Irvine was a very well-connected lawyer. He did a lot of work for the Labour Party, and he knew a lot of senior Labour Party politicians. And that was the first break for Tony Blair in politics.
It was also a big break in Tony's private life. At an office Christmas party in 1976, Tony and Cherie were part of a group playing an uninhibited game of passing a balloon between their legs. They immediately discovered a strong mutual attraction. Tony and Cherie became a couple. Though Cherie came from a working-class Catholic family and Tony was an Anglican, they both shared strong Christian beliefs.
I think he's a man of principle. He tries to put gospel values into his own life. He is a very spiritual person.
In 1979, on a romantic vacation in Tuscany, Tony asked Cherie to marry him. She said yes. They were married in 1980 in the chapel of St. John's, Oxford.
Campaign that the health service workers have been waging.
In 1982, Blair set his sights on a seat in Parliament. He ran in the Conservative district of Beaconsfield.
Our education service and our other social services at the very top of the list of priorities as things that actually matter.
At the time, Britain's Conservative Party was firmly in power,
The public are with Mrs. Thatcher.
while Blair's ineffectual Labour Party seemed hopelessly mired in the past.
It was a left-wing party. It had Marxists in it. It believed in socialism.
The old Labour ideas were about the distribution of wealth and the fact that they were the party of the working class, and they would try to rectify society and more or less make it more even.
This is Prince Smith, your Conservative candidate.
Beaconsfield had been a Conservative stronghold for years, and though he was eager and determined, Blair lost, badly. But even in defeat, he gained recognition.
If you fight a very, very good campaign, although you're hopelessly unsuccessful, you bring yourself to public attention. And one thing that I remember in a rather satirical article that was written said, indeed, there isn't a Tory mum in the whole of Beaconsfield who wouldn't be delighted if the Labour candidate invited her daughter out to supper. That always stuck in my mind as a very early acknowledgement of his tremendous communication skills.
The campaign had also provided him with valuable introductions to Labour leaders like Neil Kinnock and John Smith. A year later, though, came a stroke of political good fortune. Quite unexpectedly, a parliamentary seat became available in the Labour-friendly district of Sedgefield, near Blair's childhood home of Durham. Blair's name was put on the ballot, and to the surprise of some, he won. It was a victory that made Tony Blair Labour's youngest member of Parliament and a rising political star.
I've been very lucky, but I'm acutely conscious of the fact that the history of politics is littered with the P45s of those who were supposed to be rising stars and ended up being shooting stars.
Tony and Cherie moved into a house in the Trindon area of Sedgefield, where in 1984, Cherie gave birth to a son, Ewan. He was followed 2 years later by Nicholas, and 2 years after that by Catherine. Cherie balanced motherhood with her job as a high-powered lawyer. Her lucrative salary made her the family breadwinner.
She is possibly one of the top trial lawyers in the country. She has an A1 intellect. It says that she rules the roost, that at home she's in some ways the dominant one, that she has Tony Blair twisted around her little finger. I'm not sure if you could go that far, but she's certainly a really strong personality.
But Tony was the image of the family man, spending much of his time at home.
When he was a junior politician, he was unusual in that he would see more of his children than possibly most men in ordinary sort of 9-to-5 jobs do, even in Britain today. So he is genuinely grounded in his family.
There is no doubt that Tony Blair has an extremely happy marriage. He's devoted to his children and to his wife, Cherie, and he is a passionate man when it comes to his own family.
In Blair's other home, Parliament, the boy who once questioned the rules now questioned his own party. Blair believed the Labour Party needed an overhaul.
Image of the Labour Party's got to be an image that's more dynamic, more modern, more suited to the 1980s.
That belief was reinforced in the general election of 1983, when Margaret Thatcher's Conservatives trounced Labour.
When Tony Blair started his rise in the mid-1980s, politics in Britain was dominated by Mrs. Thatcher, dominated by a fairly uncompromising right-wing agenda. She had a great deal of wind in her sails, nothing could stop her.
We want to see our industries rebuilt on the rock-hard and well-tested foundations of incentive and profit, and we're going to do it.
The Labour Party, in contrast, was very uncertain of its direction, very divided in its ranks, very unclear about its identity. Tony Blair came into the House with a new generation of people, and they set about, with people like me and Neil Kinnock, who was our leader then, in turning the party round.
So the personable Blair was soon trotted out as a poster boy for the rebirth of Labour.
He performs. He has a naturalness, he has an attractiveness to the viewer.
Hello there.
He loves the limelight, he loves to move people, he loves the cheers of the crowd, But he is also someone who wants to do good in the world, not so much in the politician's sense as in a slightly vague Christian sort of touchy-feely way. And for him, politics is just the pursuit of those aims by another means.
And he'd really turned the Labour Party on its head and created a party that, was pro-capitalism, but also cared for the individual and cared for the health service and other areas that mattered.
Tony's appeal only went so far. Despite the efforts of Labour's modernizers, the Conservatives won national elections in 1987, and then again in 1992. Tony witnessed his party's fourth straight defeat.
They were desperate at that stage. They'd lost 4 general elections in a row. There was a lot of talk about Labour never making it back into government again, and they would have, as one of Tony Blair's colleagues said, they would have accepted that the moon was made of blue cheese if they thought it would help to win.
While Tony Blair's Labour Party continued to languish, in America, a new style of leader was about to take office, and his name was William Jefferson Clinton.
We won together a great victory for the American people tonight, and you were part of it, and I appreciate it.
Bill Clinton's victory in 1992 was an inspiration to Tony Blair. Soon after the U.S. elections, Blair made a pilgrimage to Washington, D.C. to find out how Clinton had pulled off the very trick he was contemplating back home, bringing his unpopular party back to life.
He was extremely inquisitive about how Clinton had done this, and yet he wanted to know exactly how to do it himself.
Though he didn't meet with the president on this trip, he did meet with Clinton's close advisors.
The fact that Tony Blair knew enough to come to the United States, to understand the '92 campaign, to make common cause with the people who supported my husband in his efforts to transform the Democratic Party, told me that this was a person who had the qualities for modern leadership that we need.
Blair was interested in winning also. This is very important in politics. There are a lot of politicians who get to a certain point and are actually not interested in doing what it takes to win.
Blair did not yet have real power. He didn't even have the leadership of his own party. That job belonged to John Smith, and it looked like it would remain so for some time. But on May 12, 1994, Labour leader John Smith died suddenly of a heart attack. The leading candidates to succeed him were Tony Blair and his longtime friend, Gordon Brown. However, the ambitious Blair was not about to let friendship get in his way.
There was Tony Blair taking everybody by surprise with an early bid for the leadership, which everybody had thought it was to be agreed was to go to Gordon Brown. Certainly took Gordon Brown by surprise.
The question in many people's minds wasn't who was more qualified, but who was most likely to win the next general election and put the new Labour Party in power at last.
Certainly, Tony Blair was ruthless and single-minded in his pursuit of the top job. And that caused tension with Gordon Brown, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister, who thought that the job was his, but hadn't realised the extent to which Tony Blair came across so much better on television and so much embodied the change that the Labour Party needed to make in order to win, that it was inevitable that when John Smith died, the party would turn to Tony Blair as its leader.
Within 3 weeks of Smith's death, Gordon Brown stepped aside as Tony Blair took control of the Labour Party. But he was hardly a darling of the media. From the beginning, the press pelted him with nicknames, using everything from Bambi to suggest that he was a helpless young man caught in the political headlights, to Stalin, implying his lust for power.
Tony Blur, Tony Liar, Phony Tony, Tony Baloney, all part of the same idea that there's something slightly fake about the guy. At the same time, they see him as a rather successful fake and a winner.
The name-calling did little damage. By the end of Blair's first year as leader, the Labour Party was gaining fast in opinion polls. But the real feat would be getting elected Prime Minister.
Our practice in society
In 1996, Blair sent his communications director, Peter Mandelson, back to Washington to study President Clinton's tactics.
I went to Washington, I remember it was in December 1996, talked with the White House people, had a whole series of meetings, and just absorbed so much, not just the ideas and the policies, but also the campaign style, the rhetoric, the communications, as well as just basic organization. I talked to the campaign organizers and I went through everything, right from when they got up in the morning, when they took a shower, when they slept on the couch, and right down to that sort of nitty-gritty. It gave us a lot of hope.
Blair also flew to Washington to meet with Bill and Hillary Clinton himself.
I first met Tony Blair before he was Prime Minister at a reception that my friends Sid and Jackie Blumenthal had for him at their home. And he was just so approachable and conversational. We stood by the hors d'oeuvre table just talking for a very long time about what he was trying to do with the Labor Party and what Bill and so many of us had tried to do with the Democratic Party.
We knew we had to reform our parties to not in a way that left our basic values, but in a way that had approaches that would work in the modern world. And I think it gave us a certain closeness.
Blair and Clinton discovered they had a lot more in common than just politics, and they quickly became friends.
They're both sort of intellectuals. They think, there's a lot of depth, they like going into the detail a lot. So in all sorts of ways, they connected, and connected very strongly.
They're both married to strong women, who are both professional women, lawyers, as it happens. They are men of the same generation, although Clinton is a bit older. Clinton's the older brother in this relationship.
They're joined by an absolute laser-like concentration on how to get results.
They're young, they're pragmatic.
I'm fine. How are you doing?
Both got the same warmth and very welcoming air.
Hi, Leslie.
Hi, how are you?
Fine. How are you doing?
Great. Hi.
60 Minutes took notice that the colorful member of Parliament was even sounding like the president.
Has been wrong and a disaster.
Not bigger government, but more effective government.
Not bigger government, better government.
New ideas for new challenges.
New challenges, new ideas.
It means you can be tough on crime and smart at the same time.
So we will be tough on the causes of crime, but tough on crime too.
Opportunity and responsibility. They go hand in hand.
And in return for those opportunities, responsibility.
Why do you have the same phrases? Are you getting his speeches?
No, absolutely not. But I think that I think the themes are very similar, and I mean,
but the words are the same.
Well, opportunity, responsibility, these things, yeah, I mean, they are. And I think doing it, this idea of common approach, there are certain things that you have to do together. And a common and national, I think there are even more than that.
There are more than that. We've got it
you could see, but I mean, it's not that we've sort of gone through each other's speeches. I don't think it's that at all.
The more damaging criticisms of him are to do with, Tony Blair, the sort of indistinct nature of his beliefs, the sort of woolliness.
But there was nothing blurry about Blair's political picture as he campaigned for Prime Minister. Just around the corner was the next general election. In any language, the smiling boy from Edinburgh, who had long flirted with fame, now had a date with history.
Good evening. The scale of Labour's victory was greater than even its most optimistic predictions and amounts to the most devastating rout of a government in living memory. In fact, for the Conservatives, it was the worst result in more than 150 years.
On May 1st, 1997, Tony Blair's dream came true. He became Prime Minister, Britain's youngest in almost 200 years.
And this new Labour government will govern in the interests of all our people, the whole of this nation. That I
On May 1st, 1997, 43-year-old Tony Blair handed the Conservatives their worst defeat in a century and a half. All the hard work had finally paid off.
Blair had arrived at the hall where the Labour Party faithful had gathered all night, hearing the astonishing results of a Labour Party landslide.
A new dawn has broken, has it not?
It had taken only 14 short years for Tony Blair to complete his political ascent. Clinton's student had learned his lessons well. Blair and the president became closer than ever, and they would share many moments together at Chequers, the country retreat for the Prime Minister and his family.
I remember one night we spent at Chequers. Bill was determined that Tony was going to learn to love golf, and Tony, being an indulgent, good friend and a wonderful host, agreed to get up literally at the crack of dawn, because we were leaving to go somewhere like at 9 o'clock to play a few holes of golf so that Bill could try to share this extraordinary love with him. Now that's a real friend.
Tony had never played golf and he wanted to go with me, so we borrowed a set of clubs and he went. And I hit 2 drives and I let him play the better of the 2 on every hole. Otherwise, he just picked up these clubs. We played 6 holes. He had never hit a golf ball before. I showed him how to hold the club, how to grip it, how to swing. He made 4 pars and 2 bogeys. He'd never hit the ball before. And I looked at him and I said, I knew you were a better politician than me, but I really hated that you're a better golfer than I am.
Once Blair became Prime Minister, he had an immediate effect on the tone of British life. He was truly a modern leader.
This was like a rebirth in Britain. He was so popular, he was youthful, he was good looking, and he would wear jeans, he was casual, he was informal, he was a real family man, and he was seen as somebody who had a finger on the pulse of Britain and what made Britain work.
I want people like you to admire Britain for what we are, not what we have been. The Britain of the elite is over.
Out went stuffy lords and ladies, and in came popular culture icons like fellow baby boomer and entrepreneur Richard Branson.
The fact that we have a Prime Minister who is younger, who has a young family, who's played in a rock band, all that has contributed to making Britain, a more hip place than it used to be before.
Blair's administration appeared to be Hollywood on the Thames, and he and Cherie were the host of the party, entertaining celebrities of all kinds. Suddenly, British politics was fun and fresh, and spicier than ever before. Although not everyone was hip to the changes, some people felt he was trying too hard to create a modern image.
I think that actually what it's succeeding in doing is really being rather vulgar. That's cool Britannia, I think I prefer a slightly warm.
But while the opposition complained, Blair's appeal spread, even to non-voters.
And you're determined to make that difference.
He was easy to understand, and the glitz was attention-getting.
I think he has brought up the awareness of politics and democracy and things like that in young people's lives, because before I never would have even thought twice about it.
Inside number 10 Downing Street, there was a youth movement as well. On May 20th, 2000, Cherie gave birth to their 4th child, a son. Tony Blair had just turned 47 years old.
I mean, it was one of those memorable moments, certainly. Because it's just not something you expect. I mean, my youngest kid's almost 12 now. So there was a lot of joy, but if I'm being completely blunt about it, it was a lot of shock as well. I mean, I'm delighted. In fact, I'm really delighted it's going to happen. But you feel almost as if your life's beginning over again.
He and Cherie named the baby Leo after Tony's father. Blair's youth was echoed once again. Baby Leo was the first child born to a sitting prime minister in 152 years.
Tony Blair says himself that he does change nappies or diapers. He's the one that gets up and does the night shift. And I don't know how he does that given the enormity of his job, but he does a lot of domestic duties. He knows where the washing machine is. And Cherie does the cooking, but between them, they are a completely modern household. They both work full time and they both make time with the children.
Along with diaper changing, Blair was active in other domestic fronts. He was determined to strengthen the people's patriotism and granted Wales and Scotland limited autonomy.
My government have fulfilled their commitment to establish a Scottish Parliament and a Welsh Assembly.
On the international stage, Blair quickly assumed a leading role by arguing that NATO should send ground troops into Kosovo to challenge Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic.
I want to tell you this about Kosovo. I think the day that this movement, with its values, when we could do something about it, would walk away from the worst case of ethnic cleansing and racial genocide since World War II, we'd have something to be ashamed of.
Blair was a strong force with his tactics and his passion, and he took an aggressive stance even when his allies weren't fully committed.
Now, once Tony Blair has made up his mind, once he has arrived at a settled view, nothing's going to stop him.
Tony Blair made his biggest impression on the world only a few months into his first term. On the night of August 31st, 1997, Blair was sleeping in bed when he got a phone call that would shock him and the rest of the world.
He was just woken up in the middle of the night to be told that the Princess Diana was seriously injured in a car crash, and then a few hours later it emerged that she'd died. And he realised that he was going to have to say something because he was going to church the next day, and there would be cameras there.
She was the people's princess. And that's how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and in our memories.
Blair's emotional address set just the right tone. He said the right things at just the right time, handling it with perfect poise.
When Diana was killed, initially the royal family were quite aloof about it. He came out, he coined the phrase the people's princess, and just managed to capture the mood not just of the British nation, but I think of the whole world at the time.
Tony Blair helped heal his nation with his compassion and great sensitivity. 4 years later, he would not only be calming his own people, but he would be standing alongside America in one of its darkest hours. On September 11, 2001, within the space of a few minutes, the world changed forever, and Tony Blair changed with it. The unprecedented terrorist attack against the United States required extraordinary responses on the part of world leaders, and Prime Minister Blair rushed to America's side.
Once again, we are joined together in a great cause. So honored the British Prime Minister has crossed an ocean to show his unity with America. Thank you for coming, friend.
This, of course, is a moment of the utmost gravity for the world. None of the leaders involved in this action want war. None of our nations want it. We are a peaceful people. But we know that sometimes, to safeguard peace, we have to fight.
Blair was catapulted onto the world stage, and it was a moment that he seized with confidence.
He showed to be a true friend, and I appreciate that.
And he was immediately energized. He was transformed from being a sort of a cautious, risk-averse domestic politician into a world statesman.
We only do it if the cause is just, but this cause is just. The murder of innocent people in America was an attack on our freedom, our way of life, an attack on civilized values the world over.
Through his eloquence and conviction, he reminded Americans that we are not alone, and that meant a great deal to us. I don't think he knows how closely and deeply he touched the hearts of Americans with his passionate defense of freedom and opposition to terrorism and his standing with us.
America will never forget the sounds of our national anthem playing at Buckingham Palace, on the streets of Paris, and at Berlin's Brandenburg Gate.
In the weeks that followed the attacks, Blair was a driving force, preparing the world for the coming war.
He's played a critical role in reaching out to other nations, particularly in trying to put together a coalition against terrorism. He's traveled to places like Pakistan and Syria that would have been very difficult for our president or vice president to go. And so his friendship to the United States has been matched by his ferocious commitment to protecting lives and values and our way of life, which is really at stake in this global war against terrorism. He understands it. He understands it to the, bone of his body.
We have set the objectives to eradicate Osama bin Laden's network of terror and to take action against the Taliban regime that is sponsoring him.
I think you have to understand Tony Blair's response to September the 11th at a number of levels. The basic gut level is one of real anger, and to make sure not only that it goes punished, but defeated as well in the long term.
Never forget how we felt watching the planes fly into those twin towers. Never forget those answering machines. Never forget how we felt imagining how mothers told children that they were about to die.
The world crisis in 2001 was the ultimate test of Tony Blair as a prime minister. It was a challenge he had been preparing for all his life. In a world menaced by a frightening new breed of terrorism, Tony Blair's leadership helped ensure his place in history.
One of the interesting things about Tony Blair is that he's seen as being quite Churchillian, especially since the war began. He really is seen as pulling Britain together in a patriotic way.
And I think in the world they'll see him as the Prime Minister under whom Britain's prestige rose, its influence increased, and that he left both his country and the world a different, and I think a better place than when he started. I hope so anyway.
He will be known as a leader who basically prepared Britain for a new century and who gave people a sense of their possibilities within this country and their nation's possibilities within a new world.
Tony Blair is an authentic, sincere human being who believes that his calling is political because he sees it as the best way to bring about positive changes in people's lives. And the fact that he's effective drives his enemies crazy.
Blair's close relationship with Bill Clinton has led many to speculate how he and President Bush will work together during this current crisis. According to one senior American diplomat, the two leaders suit each other just fine. Blair gives Bush a perspective he couldn't get from 1,000 intelligence reports, says the diplomat. There are no filters between them. It is diplomacy in its purest form.